Hey guys, Joe here. Today is my super big pleasure of being able to bring you my first custom knife. This is the Henchman from Compliance Edge, a small American bladesmith out in California that does everything you see here by hand, both the blade and the Kydex sheath. The clip was extra. This whole package is just super stunning, super sleek. I've not been able to find a single flaw on it. And for the price, it's absolutely mind-blowing. Now, I'd like to start with price just so people don't have any unreasonable expectations. If it's just so far out of your budget, I understand. But please keep watching, even if this is a little bit of a sticker shock to you. This comes in at $215. If you're someone who's used to buying budget knives, that's going to seem like a crazy price. But if you're someone who's really into knives, you've seen what other makers charge for custom fixed blades like this with inferior steels like D2 and 1095, with this coming in at 3V, you can understand how $215 is a great, amazing price for this guy. But if you're still on the fence, or you're still someone who's like, no way I'm spending more than $100 or $200 on a knife, I will be giving you a budget alternative to this throughout the end of the video. And I'm also going to be explaining why this is such a great deal. So if you end up liking that budget option, you might want to consider saving up the money to just go ahead and buy this guy down the road, because it's such an amazing knife and it's going to blow that budget option out of the water. It's definitely worth the cost difference. That budget option will come in right around, I believe, $70 to $75, much more reasonable. So let's get into the actual knife itself. Again, it comes with the sheath. The clip was an extra $15, so it's $215. I spent an extra little bit for that clip, making this a $230 purchase. We've got about a 3.5 inch blade. He lists the cutting edge at about 3.3. That's about right. And in terms of the handle length, we've got about 1, 2, 3, and a 4-inch handle. That's about my golden ratio. I like 4 to 3 or 4 to 3.5 in terms of handle to blade length. So for me, that is really perfect. I have above average hands, and if I can get in front of the camera here, you can see I get a nice purchase, a full 4-finger grip on that guy with a little bit to spare. And so if you've got even small hands, this knife will be great for you. If you have extra large hands, this may or may not work. You might want to go with one of his other models, the DCK, I believe it's called, which is slightly bigger. It has a spear point, a blade guard, and a pommel guard, and some jimping. It's pretty much this on steroids. So if you have extra large hands, consider that one. Just understand that it is more expensive. There is more work to go into that one. Now let's bring in some size comparisons before I really start gushing over this knife. How about a Paramilitary 2? Right there, you can see that the Paramilitary 2 is obviously longer, but if we line up the cutting edges, they're very similar. If anything, the Compliance Edge Henchman has maybe an 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch longer cutting edge than the Paramilitary 2. So you are getting a full-size knife in a compact package. Let's bring in another large knife, well, a super large knife with the Benchmade Adamas. This is obviously going to be much bigger, but again, if you compare cutting edges, they're very similar. Bring in a smaller knife with the Ontario Rat 2. So you can see there, it's a good mid-size, full-size knife, I would say, with the Henchman. And then lastly, I want to bring in my go-to EDC fixed blade, which I carry on the trails with me, the Cold Steel Mini Pendleton Hunter, also in 3V, but it's pretty much dwarfed by the Henchman. But they do have different purposes. This is a simple outdoorsman knife, kind of a backup for skinning game, or for what I use it for with wood processing. I've actually batoned wood with this knife. I can link to the video somewhere up top. This guy is firmly EDC tactical, so they do have slightly different ideologies behind them. Now, going into this knife, it is just such an amazing example of craftsmanship. Everything is smooth. The handle, in terms of the metal and the G10, the screws do not stick up too far. The spine is really nicely rounded. That is something to point out. This is a more EDC tactical knife, so you're not going to be using this for bushcraft, striking ferro rods, and things like that. It does have a nice smooth spine. That's what you want for this kind of knife. You don't always need 90-degree edges, as everyone in the outdoors crowd has a hard-on for. So for that purpose, it is just super really great. It fits in my hand really comfortably. Even though it is a more compact knife, I do have pretty big paws. I still have no problem with this knife like I do some other more compact knives. That's always the risk when you go with this style of fixed blade, is that they're too thin, and so it's very uncomfortable to use. Because he has those nice slabs of G10 in there to fatten it out, it helps overcome that issue. Now, this is an extremely thick slab of 3V, you can see there, and it carries it almost all the way down to the tip. That is something I really, really like about this knife, because say in a true emergency, whether it's a natural disaster, man-made disaster, whatever, this isn't just going to be a knife. I could technically even use this as a pry bar. Now, that's not what it's intended for, but with it being a thick slab of 3V, I absolutely could pry open at the very least, a residential home door with this. If I couldn't kick it in for some reason, maybe I had a back injury act up or my legs were having some sort of problem, I could jam this into the door frame, pry the wood apart, and get that door open. So this isn't just a knife for me, it's an emergency pry bar. And for that purpose, it just is such a great knife. 3V is overkill for a pry bar. It's just so insanely tough. It's going to hold an edge extremely well. The weak side to this being 3V in terms of the EDC purposes here is you're probably not going to want to use this around water, especially salt water, unless you're really going to keep it oiled and well maintained. And you're probably not going to use this for food prep. I have done it, but it will kind of corrode with certain types of food. This does have a Cerakote coating on the entire blade, including under the G10, but you got to remember the edge is not coated. It's not protected from corrosion, so you can corrode the edge, which will diminish its cutting capabilities, and you will have to, at the very least, strop it, depending on how severe the rust is or the corrosion is. You might even have to resharpen it. And 3V isn't necessarily the hardest thing to sharpen, but it's also not easy to sharpen either, so you want to kind of keep that edge as pristine as possible, especially since this is also intended as a backup tactical self-defense knife. The idea is that this is going to be kind of your backup knife or an emergency knife. This is going to be your main daily driver. You'll probably partner this with some sort of pocket knife and use the pocket knife as your go-to and this as your backup. But this can still act as your one and only knife if you choose to do so. Just be reasonable. This is a thick knife. Even though it's super sharp and can cut cardboard and food and all that stuff, it's not going to be the best at it. It's not going to be like the Paramilitary 2 with that nice thin slicey edge. But also, unlike the Paramilitary 2, it's going to be tough as nails. This is one of the few knives now in my collection where I'd actually be willing to stake my life on it. This could be my one and only knife during an apocalypse. Out of all the knives in my collection, I would be totally okay with that. Now, to kind of talk about the price, $215 for a knife this size might seem unreasonable to people, but you need to understand that 3V is absolutely a super awesome steel, super tough, holds an edge well. You will not break this knife unless you do something absolutely severely stupid. I could probably hammer this into a tree, stand on it, and not damage it one little bit. So it's that kind of bomb-proof knife. This thing will probably outlast me. When we compare it to, say, folders, since a lot of you guys are more on the folding side of things, a similar price knife that is also a tactical EDC folder is the Benchmade Bailout. They're very similarly priced in, when you buy a clip like I did, it was $230. These go anywhere between $230, $240. They are very similarly sized in terms of handle, in terms of blade length, but you're getting an inferior knife with the Benchmade. This guy is so much thicker. If we look at the blade stock, it's going to be way, way less likely to damage the blade in an emergency prying situation. M4 is tough on this bailout, but 3V is just so much tougher, especially with this stock thickness. And also, unlike with a fixed blade, when you have these kinds of folders, these tactical folders, no matter whether it's something nice and thin like this guy, or it's something big and beefy like the Benchmade Adamas, it doesn't matter so much about the blade as it does also the pivot. You could have a folder with equally thick blade stock, even with just the same blade steel as well with 3V, and it would still be weaker than the fixed blade alternative because of the pivot. The pivot in this case is aluminum with a thin steel liner. If that gets warped in any sort of way, your blade will be out of whack. If you bust the lock or damage the lock or the ball bearing pivots or get grit in there with your phosphor bronze washers, you're going to have issues with the knife. a fixed blade is pretty much bomb-proof. There is no point of failure. There is no moving parts. There is nothing to break on this knife. Even if I were to shatter or split the G10 handles, I can still use the knife. I can wrap the knife with paracord. So this is just a much more bomb-proof knife for the same price if you're also buying it with a pocket clip. If you don't need an attachment system, you're saving even more money over this guy, so it'll be about $15, $20 less than the Benchmade bailout. So for an EDC tactical knife, I would highly recommend the Compliance Edge Henchman. This is just such a great value. You're getting a bomb-proof beast of a knife with really great smoothness, excellent attention to detail with finish. There is not a single problem with this knife. And at $215 for an American handmade custom knife, no CNC machining, no sending it off to somebody else, this is just such a great value. The only weak point in this knife, and it's not even really a weak point, is probably how tight the Kydex sheath is. This sheath is handmade and custom fit to this specific knife. It's not made off of a blank. And as you can hear, if I hold the clip, absolutely no rattle. That is in there extremely good, but it's so tight that it actually does wear a little bit on the little shoulders here of the G10. Now, one thing to note with Kydex is it will break in over time, and in turn, in cold weather like we have here in New York State, it will shrink up and tighten up in cold weather. So you don't want to necessarily try to make these too loose, but you also don't want them so tight that they cause damage to the knife. It's a very hard balancing act. He did a very good job with this. It is a little too tight for my personal preference, but again, this will loosen up over time, and if it still doesn't get to where I like it, I can just run it under hot water and shape it, and I can reshape it in the winter when it gets too tight because the Kydex shrinks. So that is the one and only complaint I could possibly have with this knife. Now, if you want something with a little bit more features, you want a pommel guard and a blade guard, because that is something I also worry about with this, is if I were to have to stab something, there isn't a whole lot to stop my finger. He does have a slightly bigger knife called the DCK and the DCKR. The R denotes a ring at the end, kind of like a karambit. The DCK is going to be just a smidge bigger. I believe it's a 4-inch cutting edge. It is a spear point. It has the guards on the top and bottom. It has jimping on the bottom and on the spine. But unfortunately, it's also about $80 more. Now, personally, as much as I want the DCK, and we will probably get one at some point to compare to the Henchman, I don't know if those extra features are truly worth the extra $80. If you're between the two and you really need those features, I would just get the DCK. But if you don't necessarily need those, I think the Henchman is just an amazing deal. The DCK, less so. I do wish the DCK came in closer to like the 260 point. I think that'd be a little bit more reasonable. He is welcome to explain to me in the comment section if he sees this why it is so much more. I just don't quite understand why it's $80 more, but there is definitely more work that goes into that, and he is doing it by hand. So maybe it just takes an extra, bit of time, extra tooling, and that ends up being really costing much more than I would expect it to. I'm not a knife maker. I don't know everything. So he's welcome to educate me and all of you guys as to why the DCK is so much more. So when compared to tactical folders that also serve as EDC knives, I think this is just the better deal. For a custom knife, the price is great. I really look forward to truly getting this in with testing, though ideally with these tactical knives, the goal is to hopefully never need to use them. I will, though, try to make it at least some experience with the EDC side of this knife and hopefully never the tactical side of this knife. But so far, I've really been blown away, really impressed by this knife. I do look forward to buying another knife from him in the future, whether we're willing to, overlook the $80 upcharge and get the DCK, or we're willing to hopefully wait and have him come out with the Vendetta, which is another knife he used to make a couple years back all the time. I really like the Vendetta, but the DCK is also pretty sweet. Now, lastly, before we go here, I do want to mention the budget alternative to this to kind of dip your toe in the water before you consider saving up for something this awesome, and that is the CRKT Seaweed. It has a very similar all blacked out construction, a very decent sheath, and it is going to be more of a budget-friendly knife. It is coming in around $70, $80, and it has SK5 steel, which is not a horrible steel, but it's definitely nowhere near close to what you're going to get out of a 3V knife. So I would highly recommend, if you are on the fence or more on the budget, you get the CRKT Seaweed, you see whether you like it or not, and if you do end up liking it, I would highly suggest you start saving money and putting it away for a Henchman or maybe one of his other models, because he really did an amazing job with this. There is not a single flaw with this knife. Even the little issue I have with the sheath being too tight, I can fix that and it'll fix itself over time. This is definitely worth the investment. So with that said, stay safe, stay informed, and I'll see you guys in the next one. We will be doing a video eventually about different carry options for fixed blades and folders, and I'll use this knife as an example in that video. I just don't know when that will come out.